welcome to my channel Tea with Nikki and welcome to Frock Tales. You can find me more often on my podcast Tea and Possibilities, where I talk about my passion for knitting and crochet every other week or so. But here on Frock Tales we talk about my other love, costume drama. Because what is life without a little costume and a little drama? This video is actually the first in a series of 3 because the costume dramas that I'm going to look at in this video and the next 2 are actually all sequels. But this week we are going to be kicking off with one of my favourite historical time periods, the Wars of the Roses. Which means we will be starting with the White Queen. This series is an adaptation of Philippa Gregory's books The White Queen, The Red Queen and The Kingmaker's Daughter, which ran for 10 one-hour episodes in 2013. Now, as always, this will be a spoiler-heavy video, so if you have not watched The White Queen, please don't watch if you want to remain spoiler-free. As I said, this was based on Philippa Gregory's books. I actually really enjoyed reading The White Queen and The Red Queen. I didn't really enjoy The Kingmaker's Daughter so much, and you will probably see why when I come to talk about it later on in this video. But as always, we are going to kick off with a plot summary, but you're gonna have to bear with me because it's a big one. So, we kick off with Elizabeth Woodville. She has recently lost her husband Richard Grey fighting for the Lancastrians, so she and her 2 sons are pretty much penniless and back home living with her family. She decides to approach the new king, Edward IV, who is a Yorkist king, and ask for their lands and inheritance back. Cue the love story. Because yes, when Edward spots the beautiful Elizabeth under an oak tree, he falls instantly in love. Elizabeth Woodville refuses to be his mistress, so they marry in secret, which does not go down well with Edward's cousin Richard Neville, also known as Warwick the Kingmaker. Now, Warwick had been negotiating with France to marry Edward to a French princess for a great alliance, and unfortunately that little plan falls through because he's already married to Elizabeth. Now, because Elizabeth has so many brothers and sisters, they have to be married off into advantageous marriages, which dilutes power away from Warwick and from Edward's 2 brothers, George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Yes, that Richard. And so begins a tussle for the crown, with Warwick throwing his support first behind George, Duke of Clarence, who he marries off to his daughter Isabel, and then behind his old enemy, Margaret of Anjou, and her son, Edward of Lancaster. He marries his younger daughter, Anne, to Edward of Lancaster, even though it is quite clear at this point that Anne is secretly in love with Richard. When the Lancastrians are finally defeated, Anne is left a widow, and Warwick is killed. Anne secretly marries Richard, Duke of Gloucester. But is it for love? Or is it for money? Now, the whole time this is going on, Margaret Beaufort is scheming away because her son, Henry Tudor, not that Henry Tudor, is now the sole Lancastrian heir. And her scheming continues in the background as Edward is finally forced to execute his brother George for treason. Now, Edward and Elizabeth, despite his regular adultery, are actually very happy together. They raise a large and happy family, including 2 young princes, Edward, the Prince of Wales, and Richard, the Duke of York. The infamous Princes in the Tower. But then, when Edward dies unexpectedly, the court starts tearing itself apart. He declares his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to be the Lord Protector, but the young Edward, now Edward V, actually has more of an allegiance to his mother's family. Richard's wife, Anne, convinces Richard to have Edward's children declared illegitimate and to take the crown for himself. Edward V is delivered to the Tower of London in order to await his coronation, but the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville and her eldest child, Princess Elizabeth of York, scheme to keep the young brother Richard out of the Tower. They have him secreted away to Flanders, and in his place they send a young servant boy. Margaret Beaufort is actually the one who gives the order to her faction to have the boys killed. She has already made an agreement with Elizabeth Woodville that when Henry wins, he will marry Elizabeth of York to legitimise his claim. For that to happen, Elizabeth has to be legitimate, and if Elizabeth is legitimate, her brothers are legitimate and the rightful heirs to the throne. When it becomes clear that the princes in the Tower have been murdered, the Dowager Queen and Princess Elizabeth place a curse on the line of the person who killed them. Now Richard, who is now Richard III, knows that Elizabeth of York has been promised to Henry Tudor, his great rival. In order to discredit this match, he begins to pay Elizabeth close attention. Yes, that kind of close attention. And yes, He is her uncle. His Queen Anne is rightfully disgusted by this, but he tries to convince her that it is only politics. However, Elizabeth and Richard fall in love. Richard's son by Anne, Edward of Middleham, dies, leaving Richard with no heir. Anne herself dies a little later. And then we have the Battle of Bosworth Field. Elizabeth spends the night with Richard, but Richard is ultimately killed on Bosworth Field, leaving Henry Tudor the victor and the now King of England, Henry VII. I told you it was long. A lot happens in 10 episodes, it has to be said. A lot happens. But let's start with what I really enjoyed about this adaptation. I have to say I really enjoyed the books, The White Queen and The Red Queen. I thought they were really interesting. So I was really pleased to see this adaptation. I think the casting here was absolutely wonderful. Rebecca Ferguson makes a beautiful Elizabeth Woodville. Now, she doesn't quite look the part. If you check out any pictures of Elizabeth Woodville, you'll find that she had an incredibly high forehead. I think I read somewhere that they would actually pluck their hairline back because a high forehead was considered to be more beautiful, and she would always have her hair covered because that was considered the modest thing to do. That is not how we see Rebecca Ferguson in this adaptation. But as I've said before, I'm not a massive purist, and if we're talking about the most beautiful queen that England has ever known, I understand why they wanted her to fit a more modern sensibility of what beauty is. Max Irons makes a charming Edward IV, and I do really like the chemistry between him and Rebecca Ferguson. They make a really good match as Edward and Elizabeth. Now, James Frayne I've always had a little bit of a thing for, so I do enjoy him as Warwick the Kingmaker. He does a really good job. David Oakes also appears to have a really good time playing the slightly slimy George, Duke of Clarence. Oh, but let's talk a little bit about Aneurin Bernard as Richard. Now, I will come to the Richard storyline a little bit later in this video, but I really like Aneurin Bernard, and I think the casting of him in this is absolute perfection. He looks incredible in the period costume. He sounds incredible. Like, seriously, just sit there and just close your eyes and let him speak to you. It's really rather lovely. One of my absolute favourites when it comes to casting is Amanda Hale as Lady Margaret Beaufort. Now, she is absolutely luminous in this. She does a fantastic job with a pretty tricky character. Margaret Beaufort is pretty much always written as a maniacal, pious woman focused solely on the destiny of her son. Whether or not that's true is an entirely other story. I've read somewhere she had quite a good sense of humour, but that's almost entirely missing here. But I think Amanda Hale does a fantastic job bringing someone who could be rather one note really, really beautifully to life. And there are some really lovely moments. I also really like that she looks young in this. Margaret Beaufort was only about 13 when she gave birth to Henry Tudor. I'm going to let that sink in because she was about 13 and her husband Edmund Tudor was in his 20s. So she and her son do not really have a massive age gap, and it's really lovely to see that reflected in the casting. I really liked that. Now, much as I might roll my eyes at Margaret's interpretation of every single sign as her own personal green light to do whatever she wants, I really, really enjoyed Amanda Hale. She absolutely sold this completely. Unlike Faye Marcy. Now, Faye Marcy plays Anne Neville, and I will caveat this. The Kingmaker's Daughter is the Anne Neville novel. Try saying that 5 times really fast. But this is the story of Anne Neville, and to be honest, I didn't really enjoy the book because I found her whiny and boring and just really, really dull. And unfortunately, that carries over to the adaptation. So in that respect, they do a very good job adapting her. But where Amanda Hale manages to sell a would-be one-note character, Faye Marcy really doesn't. I personally found nothing likeable, nothing to care about in Anne. And while some of the other characters are despicable and frustrating, and Elizabeth herself, at times, you want to bang your head into a brick wall because she's so stupid, but they manage to make you care about them. Unfortunately, we don't get that with Anne Neville, and I was quite happy when she died off, frankly. That's a terrible thing to say, but yeah, I was quite pleased when she was gone. When it comes to things like costumes, I didn't mind them. Now, as I've said, a lot of the women are running around with their hair down, which was completely immodest, but I do understand why that is done, because to our modern eyes it looks attractive. On the whole, I thought the costuming was fine insofar as I didn't notice that it was glaringly horrible. There were a couple of dresses that Elizabeth Woodville wears that look a little bit peasanty for her station as a lady before she is married. And there are some fur trimmings that aren't quite not fake looking, but on the whole I thought they did a pretty good job. There is also a magical element to the series because Elizabeth Woodville is said to be descended from the water goddess Melusina, and because of this she and the women of her line are able to do magic. So we see at the beginning her mother Jacquetta telling her fortune, and then of course towards the end of the series we see Elizabeth and her daughter Elizabeth of York cursing the male line of those who killed the princes in the Tower. I actually really enjoyed the magical element, partly because it added a fun little addition to the series, but also because it's not going to become part of public kind of knowledge. It's not going to be absorbed into the public consciousness as a true fact because it's magic. We all kind of know that's probably not real. But what about things I didn't like? Now I'm going to be really honest and say I didn't enjoy The Kingmaker's Daughter, and this series is based in part on that novel. I found Anne to be boring and weak and whiny and just not particularly likeable, and unfortunately that carries over into the series, and Faye Marcy, who plays her, just doesn't lift that portrayal up into anything more than that. She's completely obsessed with the idea of Elizabeth being a witch who has cursed their line, and she just never really grows beyond this very small and very narrow characterization that she's given, which I think is really, really sad, because Anne Neville is the daughter of Richard Neville, the Kingmaker, and her story is fascinating and tragic, and she is at the centre of so many of these events. And it's just a shame that they didn't give her character more oomph, really. I thought it was also interesting that they had Anne kind of suggest to one of their captains that it would be good if the boys were killed, the boys in the Tower. And I quite liked that because I could understand it. It made sense to me because if she wants to be secure on her throne and secure the throne for her son in the future, that is something that would have potentially have crossed their minds, and I like that they acknowledge that. And as I said, she is the daughter of Warwick the Kingmaker. She understands what it means to be ruthless in pursuit of the throne, so I thought that was a really nice detail. However, the real thing that got me about this series is the twist. Now, I cannot say whether or not Philippa Gregory believes this or she just wanted to write a novel where she gave a twist on what we think we already know. Because I think most of us would say that the princes in the Tower were killed by Richard III. And according to Philippa Gregory, that's just not true. No, according to Philippa Gregory, the person who killed the princes in the Tower is the incredibly pious and devoted Lady Margaret Beaufort. Yeah, let that sink in. Now, as I said, Margaret Beaufort and Henry Tudor need Elizabeth of York to be legitimate so that she can marry Henry Tudor and legitimise his claim. So I understand that. However, Margaret Beaufort could not have had the opportunity to do this, and I cannot imagine a woman so famed for her piety would allow it to. I find Richard III an incredibly fascinating character because everything we know about him up until the death of his brother is that of the perfect courtier. He is supportive of his brother, he never reaches beyond his station, he does a fantastic job as a lord in the north, and he is everything that his brother Duke of Clarence is not. But then something happens when Edward IV dies, and it is only his two nephews between him and the throne. And I find that interesting because if Edward IV had not died so young, it is entirely possible that Edward V would have been a grown man, kept his throne, and the Richard Duke of Gloucester would have been nothing more than a footnote in history. But what happened to that man to make him do that? Because whatever we think may have happened to the boys in the tower, either they died of natural causes or they were killed on the orders of their uncle. That is my personal belief. Much as I would love to be proven otherwise, I don't think that we could argue that that's really what happened. So to have Philippa Gregory come along and try to tell us that it was Margaret Beaufort that had this organised, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. The reason this bothers me and the magic stuff doesn't is because that is the kind of thing that does become part of the public consciousness, and people do start saying, oh, it was her, not him. And I just think that's not really fair or accurate, frankly. But historical accuracy aside, what it really comes down to is, would I recommend this? And the answer is yes. It is a very, very sexy retelling of a period of English history that I hope will have you reaching for more information, whether it be documentaries or books on the subject, because it is truly a fascinating time period full of incredible people. However, I have shared here the most glaring historical inaccuracy that I think I have ever seen in a historical adaptation. So on that note, maybe watch with caution. Well, thank you so much for joining me with this video about the White Queen. If you did see the White Queen and enjoy it, please let me know below. And if you hated it, let me know as well. And I'll be back next time to take a look at the White Queen sequel, The White Princess.